Vito Acconci. Thank you for joining us at SHOWstudio. Could you describe briefly what it is that you do?
I work as part of a group of people, Acconci Studio. I admit if I was forming a country studio now, I don't think I would give it my name. I think I would try to give it a group name. The people who work with me are designers, architects. I don't come from an architecture background. I come from a writing background that then became a kind of specific kind of art background, concentrating in live activity, performance. Gradually that became installations, and installations for me were places where people could be. So from installations I thought, I don't know if I'm interested in people being in a gallery. I'm interested in people being in the city, in a so-called public space. So gradually the stuff became architecture. One reason to work as part of a group of people is because I don't have an architecture background. But there's a more major reason for working as part of a group of people. I don't think something public can come from a single person. I think something really public can come from people talking together, people disagreeing. When I think of space, I think in terms of number. You know, one is a solo, two is a couple or a mirror image. The third person starts an argument, and public probably begins when argument starts. So the way the studio works is, you know, I start a project off with a general idea, then we talk a lot.
And that's interesting that you say that, because the first, your first endeavours into art were poetry, then conceptual art, performance art, and it's sort of, that's a very individual thing to do.
Yeah.
What sort of group collaboration was involved in that?
None.
None at all.
No. But I think what happened is I grew up. You know, you start as a child, then you realize there are other people around, and it was important to me on a page to. I never thought of meaning necessarily. I never thought of subject matter. I wanted words to be fact. I wanted words. What was important to me is the relation of words, print on a page. When I was writing, I thought of movement. How do I move? How do I move from left margin of the page to right margin? How do I move from one page, next page, etc. After a while, I thought, why am I limiting this movement to a page? There's a world out there. There's streets out there. There's a ground out there. Therefore, stuff went to a place for live activity. Why? Because the time kind of ordered it. It was the end of the '60s. It was a time when everybody was using language like trying to find myself. So and it was a time, the music of the time always reveals the time. It was a time of single voice, long song. Neil Young, Van Morrison, a single voice trying to find the self, evolve around the self. I always hoped stuff of mine could catch on to a time, could maybe, I always wanted to go further. I don't know if that's necessarily what happened, but I always wanted to. I didn't want to be out of time. I didn't want. The past means very little to me. The future means a lot. But I don't exactly know how to design the future. But maybe by trying your hand at the present, you can anticipate a future.
Well, one of the requirements on your website is that the architect, or landscape architect that you're looking for, is somebody who is interested in buildings that couldn't have been built before the 21st century.
That's kind of important. Do we really do that? We hope we do that, but I don't know if we do that enough. I don't know if we Uh, uh, sometimes I wonder, am I kind of kidding myself? Do I get some ideas from the past without realizing it? If I do get ideas from the past, I hope I can try to reinvent it, or revive it in terms of the present. When I think of why did I became an architect, or a so-called architect, or a pretend architect, or a wannabe architect, relatively late. It wasn't until 1988 that the studio formed. I was already 48 years old, But I started doing stuff like architecture throughout the 80s. I started a current, but I wasn't exactly sure where it was. I'm not exactly sure what it's leading to. So sorry. Maybe you can remind me of a question you started.
Well, I guess sort of bouncing off that. In a New York Times article actually about another conceptual architect, Lebbeus Woods. The author, I forget her name right now. Said, by abandoning fantasy for the more pragmatic aspects of building, the profession has lost some of its capacity for self-criticism, not to mention one of its most valuable imaginative tools. Do you think that your architecture is trying to bring back some of the kind of imagination and progress?
Well, I wanted to, but I don't think she's talking about imagination and process. She's talking about self-criticism. There were incredible problems with architecture, like there are with any discipline. The problem with architecture is that when you design a space, you're also designing people's behavior in space. So probably architecture is almost inherently a totalitarian activity. You're telling people what to do. I think but there is architecture, including ours, that tries to do something different. Tries to do something where maybe architecture could be at the service of people, maybe rather than the other way around. It's not so easy, but and right now I don't even know if it can be done. It probably can be done with a combination of the physical and the virtual, but I think it has to be more than that. What architecture really has to become is a person goes into a space. Person feels tired. Person leans against the wall, and the wall starts to recede to make a kind of seating place. Person's not tired anymore. Person gets up. Another person comes in with another desire. Can architecture ever reach that? Probably not exactly. But the notion of a changeable architecture is what we're kind of obsessed with. Can people at least do something? The problem is most of the times what you can do is determined by a space say being hinged. So if it's up against the wall as part of the wall, if you bring it down, it's now a seat. It's not enough, but maybe it's practice. Maybe it's practice for the kinds of architecture that might be able to sense a person in the space. You can. We're doing a project right now in Indianapolis. It'll be finished probably in a month. It's in a tunnel through a building in the city. The building is it's a place where a lot of people in the city pass through. It's the housing for a relatively new basketball arena. When I saw the site, actually I chose the site, but when I saw the site, I thought, maybe the nice thing about this site is that it was a relatively low budget, like $700,000. And I thought, how can we do anything physical here? But then I thought, we don't have to do anything physical here because the tunnel, the way through the building is already here. So all we have to do maybe is fit it out so that people, whether they realize it or not, have something to do. So what we designed was embedded in the floor are a large number of sensors, so people inevitably walk over those sensors. When people walk over them, they activate this kind of lighting system. There are lights embedded in the ground, LED lights, thousands of LED lights, some embedded in the ground, probably half in the ground, half in a kind of mesh system above. So when you go through, by activating a sensor, you start to turn on what's kind of like this swarm of fireflies. These lights that follow, these lights that turn on and off as you walk. So that you have this, it's taken from things like how the flock of birds move. They sense each other. They don't have a leader. So it was an attempt to make a kind of space where people maybe do things by themselves.
So city planning is something that's interesting to you as well as architecture.
It is. I don't think we've ever really done. I don't know if we've done something that really counts as city planning. Planning in general is important to us, but planning in a way that we don't, ideally, when a project of ours works, I hope it's not over-planned. Can we plan maybe a general structure, various points in a possible space, but we need to leave and want to leave freedom for people. Ideally, we would love to do spaces that even if people can't change the space they're in, maybe they can start to think something like, I used to think I couldn't change the space I was in. Now here I am in a space that seems to be turned inside out or turned upside down. Can I do that? Can I do that to my own space? So I hope it would at least lead to an incentive that people can take things in their own hands. And I think it's much easier now. It's easier in the time of cell phones. It's easy, it's a time where revolutions are being started from the ground up, which I think was a lot of people's ideal. Before this, there needed to be a leader to start a revolution. The revolutions or quasi-revolutions, almost revolutions, beginnings of revolutions in many different parts of the world over the past year and a half or so, seem to have started by people grouping because you could communicate with each other very easily.
What's architecture's role in this?
What's architecture's role? Industrial design's role. Because I don't know if architects had anything to do with doing the cell phone, designing the cell phone. But once this,
I guess the sort of web architecture. You've talked about portable architecture before. And
this is web communication in order to get people to go into a space and stop the traffic from moving. So it's not just the web.
It's not just
the web starts it, but until it starts to be an actual thing. No, I don't think web architecture is enough. I don't think virtual architecture is enough. It has to lead to. I would love it to lead to revolution, and that's what a lot of us thought in the late '60s. But that would have been a funny revolution, because it was a revolution that depended on a leader. It would be a revolution that as soon as it gets in power, becomes the power structure itself. This might be different, but I don't know, because it hasn't happened yet.
And your work, you moved from poetry to conceptual performance art in about 1968.
Yeah.
That, of course, is a very significant year.
For
the student uprisings. Would you say that kind of revolutionary attitude influenced you or inspired you to change what you were doing at the time?
Well, it did. it was an incentive for me to think that it's not enough. Being on paper, writing something is far away from something. It was an incentive to think maybe people can take things into their own hands. So that probably, in retrospect, but even at that time, could I say, was it people forming in the streets that influenced me, or was it a more solitary thing? Was it the solitary Neil Young voice, the Van Morrison voice, the Leonard Cohen voice? Can't tell. They existed at the same time.
And you sort of constantly trying to turn the viewer into a performer, not into a performer, but
into an interactant, into a participant. Yeah. Is that always successful? I can't tell. I could tell easier when I was there in a space. Mm-hmm. But once we make a space, it's never I. Once we want to make a space, but a space is just a physical way of having some kind of situation, mm-hmm. Some kind of place where there might be some kind of occasion. Occasion and situation mm-hmm. interest me maybe more than place or site. At the same time, I want things to be physicalized. I don't think it's enough to do an abstract space. Though this is kind of side thought. When I think, why did I become an architect? Were there architects in the past that gave me some kind of clues? And there were. And when I think of it, the architects that I was interested in was in the 18th century, Piranesi and Boulez, and in the 1960s, Archigram. Not one built project, but a lot of ideas for spaces. And that doesn't mean that the great thing about models and drawings is they're probably easier to understand than a real space. Because a real space you have to move through. A real space isn't still. You go through instants. You don't see it all at once, which is, I think, the great thing about a real space. You know it minute by minute. You can't get maybe an overall view. So overall view probably helps you think more of other spaces. Going through a space maybe allows you to think more of, how can I interact with this space? How can I interact with people in this space? I'm oversimplifying a little bit.
Do you go through a space like you go through a poem, or do you think they're very different?
I think when I was doing poetry, the way I was thinking was how do I move from one line to another? But it was kind of cheating because 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, you can see the whole thing right in front of you. So you see the whole. You might then go. Maybe you can't see the whole of a book, but the book has covers. So the book is kind of a package. I think it's different in that you don't necessarily know what's coming. At least the first time you go into a space. After a while, you might get used to it. But that's the kind of great thing about a city, is that space is always changing. The space is always changing. People are always changing. You walk down a city street, and people are coming towards you, and you really have no idea what kind of nationality are these people. The great thing about a city is that it mixes things. So maybe you can never get used to it. Big cities.
We've talked a little bit about revolutionary movements in
yeah. Again, do I totally trust revolution? I'm starting to more now because of this. I want to think of persons more than people, because people implies it's a unit. There's a group of people thinking the same thing. I think individual persons, an aggregate, an accumulation of individual persons is more interesting because there's always disagreement. And I think if revolutions are going to occur, or I don't know, let's say some change. I don't know the way. The problem with the word revolution sometimes is that I wonder if revolution is always a cut. It's always a break. I remember when I first saw Sergei Eisenstein movies. What I thought, wow, this is so perfect. It's being done in the time of revolution, and it's in the form of montage. It's just in the form of a cut. Of course, there can't be continuity in a revolution. And was he conscious of that? Probably he was. Form is not opposite to subject matter. It's not form as on the one side, form is content. It's through form that you find content, that you find subject matter.
Do you think so you think that this, I suppose in theoretical terms, tension between signifier and signified is still something that's the most important thing to study?
I wonder if they're getting mixed. Maybe there's an easier way to mix them as soon as people have, and believe me, I don't know if I use a cell phone that often. I like to escape phone calls, but the idea of the cell phone really excites me, because you don't have to wait. You don't have to wait to get in touch with the person. Distance doesn't mean enough. So there could be this kind of contact. As soon as you know that I'm not the only person thinking this, somebody else is. Maybe somebody else somewhere else is. Then you start to think that, well, this isn't a private thought. Maybe there's an accumulation of private thoughts that don't remain private for long. That this could mean it's a difference between a point and a wave. If there are enough points acting together, it turns into a wave. Does a wave necessarily have to overcome something? Maybe it can slip inside something. I'm talking too metaphorically, but maybe because I don't know what the real thing would be.
I suppose moving towards just again talking about performance art. Your work deals with women quite a lot, or deals with or the way that.
I don't think it does. I think the reason I did performance at that time was I was jealous of women. I thought women are much more free thinking. Men are so much more directed. Why did I do pieces like burning hair off my chest, pulling at each breast, in this kind of futile attempt to develop a woman's breast? Of course, I knew it was futile, but I thought maybe this is about will. Maybe this is some kind of will towards something. This was the time of first feminist writings, and I think a big aim for me in performance was, could I almost rehearse the possibility of being vulnerable, because men didn't want to be vulnerable.
In a work like Broad Jump, how do you think women are treated there?
No, that was an amazingly sexist piece, which in retrospect I wish I hadn't done.
And did you feel that it was contrary to a feminist spirit of the age?
I did it in a particular place. I did it in, and I don't think I would have done it anywhere else. I did it in I can't remember the name of the place. It was in Atlantic City, in the place where Miss America contests were being held. I never would have thought of doing that piece if it wasn't that particular place. So I hoped maybe it wouldn't be as sexist as it seemed to appear.
Did you receive a lot of criticism for being sexist?
No. Or not that I knew.
Why do you feel now that you wouldn't have done that?
Because yes, maybe I thought I was doing it because of the site. At the same time, I was subjugating two real real persons who were women, and I thought, in retrospect, I don't think I'd want to do that. In retrospect, I think, were they doing that because they had some relation to me? And I thought, I don't know. In order to make what I thought was a point, this is whatever. I can't remember what the place was called. I think it was Convention Center in Atlantic City. But I was so interested in making this point about women are used in this place that I in turn used two very actual women that I had relations with. And I think that was wrong.
Do you think that a space suggests a work, or you suggest a work in a space?
I try to read a space, but of course I'm doing the reading, But yeah, sight is important to us. Sight is important to us because it makes things easier in a way. It makes things easier because this is your first clue about what to do. The wall projects, the wall public spaces have to fit into a place. There are probably two kinds: the kind that tries to fit in, and the kind that comes from the outside, as if a spaceship is a spaceship is landing. If we do a project in actual space, I think it is kind of important to. It's important to. I think of going to a space like a kind of, I used to be obsessed with guerrilla fighters. I was obsessed with Che Guevara's diaries. I was obsessed with them because of things like he was always talking about the importance of shoes, and I thought, I wonder why. And then I realized, well, of course, these are guerrilla fighters in the jungle. If they don't have shoes, they can't walk. If they can't walk, they can't make these little incursions. How did I get onto guerrilla fighters?
Well, actually, guerrilla fighters, I guess
it's an aggregate. It's not the institutional army.
Thinking about
that's why the United States lost the Vietnam War. They believed in the institutional army, but the Viet Cong were guerrilla fighters. It was a whole change in way of thinking.
Somebody who you made me think of very much when you were talking about community earlier on is Regis Debray. And
I don't know that well, but I have skimmed through or read a little bit, but I don't know it well.
A semi-recent article by him in New Left Review talked about how communities were formed around publications. Revolutionary communities were formed around publications. In some way, do you feel like architecture, doing something, practice, is its own kind of revolutionary activity?
I think,
and I use the word revolutionary advisedly in the sense that
I don't know. Of course, if there's one place, this place can be reported, this place can maybe lead to publications. I wonder if architecture can really be a revolutionary activity until it learns to move. I think future architecture is going to be moving buildings, or maybe they're all little small buildings. They're it's a space that can. It's probably not a space anymore. It's a situation that can be brought from one space to another. I don't think I'm going to be alive when this change happens, but there were so many clues to this. It seems like the one thing that everybody seems to feel almost around the world is a reaction against immigrants. But I think when people are so obsessed with something, it's probably a clue that maybe there aren't going to be immigrants anymore. Maybe in the future there are no borders. there were no national boundaries. Maybe in the future people become nomads again. That you carry your architecture with you. Of course, I don't know this is gonna happen. But if it's something like that, nomads would make the best revolutionaries, because there's maybe no particular country that they have to stand for.
I mean, there's this very sort of inspired and I suppose wandering quality to your work.
I hope so.
But also
wondering, or wanting to see what can we do next. Do we always do that? I started doing work a long time ago because I wanted to be excited every day. So I hoped we could, and it's much easier to do that with a group of people, because I'm not the only person thinking.
In your performance art, you planned everything very, very carefully.
I planned the structure for something, but I didn't know what the individual moments were going to be. I never rehearsed the performance, because I thought if I rehearsed it, then I would know what could possibly happen.
But you worked out how many cigarettes you were going to have, for example.
Of course not. I was just a chain smoker, so I didn't have to.
I guess moving forward into the realm of today, at SHOWstudio, we're the platform here is a sort of it's an interactive streaming performance art to a live global audience. How do you think
what is an interactive?
A SHOWstudio, which is the website.
Yeah.
And it's a platform to stream performance art to a live global audience.
Huh. I don't think I knew that. I didn't. For some very, very stupid reason, I never looked up SHOWstudio.
But how do you think the internet is changing performance art, for example?
I haven't been involved in performance art for such a long time. The last performance I did was 1973. I started to get disinterested in performance because I hated the idea. I hated the idea that everybody who knew a performance of mine knew what I looked like. And I started to think, am I doing work? Am I doing art? Or am I trying to develop a personality cult? And I hated the idea of a personality cult. The internet's probably something different. I know the internet somewhat, but as a distributor of performance, I'm not sure. I don't think I know enough how performance has affected or how internet has affected performance. But it might be about maybe that notion I had about being against image was probably important. I mean, I was in a kind of double bind. I thought if I'm going to do live stuff, I have to be in interaction with other people. Yet as a byproduct, that meant everybody knew what I looked like, and so I started to think there's a real double bind here. I liked the first part, I liked the interaction part, but I didn't like the fact that I became this kind of known quantity. But that's a side thought. I don't know how to approach your question so much because I don't know how what maybe used to be called performance happens on the internet.
For example, I mean, you still work with performance artists.
With what?
Performance artists to some extent.
How?
Somebody like Ai Weiwei, or your art was.
I don't think Ai Weiwei can be necessarily.
Or
he does
artists
architecture.
He
does architecture. He does art.
Artists who have a background, I suppose, in performance.
Who?
For example, Ai Weiwei, or for example,
did Ai Weiwei really have a background in performance?
The dropping of the pot, I guess.
The what?
The dropping of the pot.
It's a photograph. Come on.
Okay.
There's a big difference between a photographed activity. I don't think he ever did a live performance in his life. And I'm not saying this slightingly. I mean, I know him somewhat, but that never came up in our conversations. But I don't know. But I might. He's done a lot of stuff. I don't know all the stuff he did.
Or for example, recently British artists such as Ian Forsyth and Jane Pollard.
I don't even know who they are.
They reinterpreted some of your work in London.
That's not me. People can do with work what they want, but I didn't. It wasn't a collaboration. Not that it had to be. People can do what they want with stuff in mind.
I guess the one question that everybody does want to know, and I suppose is slightly and tell me if you feel uncomfortable talking about it, is that
I'm going to try not to feel uncomfortable about anything. I might not be able to answer everything.
In Seedbed, you masturbated under
how many times did I come?
How many times have you been?
I don't know, approximately 6-7 times a day, except for a time when I took speed and I couldn't even get a hard on.
Oh no, I actually meant to ask.
Sorry. A lot of people have asked this other question.
Being in that space, being under the stage, in Seedbed, masturbating.
The stage? I hoped it wasn't a stage. I think if I turned the thing, I hoped it was underneath the floor. It wasn't a stage. It was a gallery room. The only reason there was a ramp is that I wanted to be under the floor. Why did I want to be under? I mean, when that project started, it had nothing to do. It had nothing to do with masturbation. What it had to do with is something I mentioned before. I hated the idea that everybody who knew a piece of mine knew what I looked like. So I thought, how could I interact with people yet not be seen? So I thought, and I tried to think. I mean, for better or worse, I think about stuff somewhat logically. If I didn't want to be seen, I thought I could be behind the wall, I could be above the ceiling, I could be under the floor. Behind the wall seemed wrong, since it seemed like if I'm behind the wall, I might be next to people on this side of the room, but not have any contact with anybody else. Above the ceiling was impossible because the ceiling height in those galleries was very low, barely 3 meters. So I thought, well, once I built a place for me, there might not be enough place for people, or people would have to maybe bend down. And I hate the idea of art that makes people bend down. I hope I would never do that. It's like they're genuflecting, they're kneeling. Under the floor seemed possible because it seemed that once I'm under the floor, I could be moving under the floor. I'm not going to be under everybody at the same time, but by constantly moving, I could have contact. I could have contact with people. Contact in the sense that I can build sexual fantasies on those footsteps. Those sexual fantasies can keep my masturbation going. Every now and then, the masturbation reaches climax. Maybe somebody is thinking, "Oh, he's done this with me. He's done this for me." Maybe there's some kind of relation between the way masturbation and the way the thing started had nothing to do with masturbation. The problem is I didn't know what I was going to be doing under the floor. Sometimes when I'm stuck, and this happens even now, I go to a book called Roget's Thesaurus, which I'm sure is available in the UK. But there are different versions of it. The original version, you go to the back of the book, and there's an index of words. So it's like analogs of words. You try to feel out what's the word you're trying to find, and then that takes you to a place in the main body of the book. So I started with the word floor. Floor took me to words like foundation, undercurrent, and then took me to the word seedbed. So once I came upon the word seedbed, I said, "Well, I guess I've gotten a clue what to do. This is a place to spread my seed." But I wouldn't have thought of that if it wasn't for Roget's Thesaurus.
So you would reject the label by The Guardian, which claimed that you were, quote, the biggest wanker in the world.
Well, I can't reject any label. People can label me whatever they want. It just because it didn't begin as that doesn't mean that that's how everybody knows the piece. So I can't, in some ways I wish I had never done it. I think it's kind of on the one hand, it kind of made my career, but ruined it at the same time because it's taken over. Mm-hmm. It's that, no matter what I do, there used to be interesting jokes at that time. It's very easy to own Vito Acconci. All you have to do is shake his hand.
I think
I didn't make it up, but it wasn't bad.
I think we should sort of go back to a bit earlier, and I was just wondering, you grew up in the Bronx, and how did that environment affect your artwork? How did Antarctica you talk about Antarctica?
But I don't know how. I mean, that kind of background. I mean, I knew that I didn't want. I knew at a certain age that there's elsewhere. Mm-hmm. There's New York. There's Manhattan. I didn't think I was going to stay in the Bronx. Mm-hmm. The Bronx was like the country compared to Manhattan. That's overdoing it, but.
Was there a loneliness associated with it?
A loneliness? Oh. Not with being in the Bronx. I was an only child, so I made up things a lot.
And with your childhood in general, and your father took you to see the opera.
Yeah, my father. And my father, I think, taught me to be very involved with language. Mm-hmm. My father would read Dante to me in Italian, even though I didn't know Italian. But he would also play Cole Porter for me. My father, who came to the United States from Italy at the age of 11, got kind of obsessed in the American language. My father got obsessed with puns. So in some ways, I think very possibly everything I did maybe came from my father. There were other things too that influenced me. But my father, in the middle of an ordinary day, would say things like, or ask things like, "What's honeymoon salad?" And the answer was, "Lettuce alone." And then he would follow that up by saying, "Don't look now, mayonnaise is dressing." Or the Lord said to St. Peter, "Come forth," but Peter came fifth, so he lost the race. So it was such an incredible way to be in the middle of language, because at school, language as almost a kind of legal thing. Language means I do. Language is signing a contract. My father's version of language was the Marx Brothers. Was let's have everything fall apart, let's have everything explode, and I think that was so important to me.
And at school, language was also religion, I suppose.
In the beginning, yeah. I not just in the beginning. I went to Catholic school from the age of 5 till 22. I went to Catholic high school and college. But as soon as I got out, I knew that I was never going to believe anything again.
You still design religious buildings in the studio. There's a design for a church on the wall.
If you looked at here, this wasn't. These were precedents for a possible prefab housing. We've never designed a church. We've never been asked to. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean necessarily I would say no. I would design, maybe what I would think was an interesting church, but nobody would accept. Mm-hmm. But most of the things we do, nobody would accept. Not that I want that to be not that that's necessarily purposeful. But if it was this wall you were looking at, it was we put up a number of previous examples of prefab stuff. When we're starting to work at something, we just want to see what kinds of stuff have people done we can never come across. All of them, but we try.
Take me through a bit of how you would start designing a building today.
Yeah. Usually the things we design are things Well, either are things we've been asked to try our hand at, or more and more we're entering. Sometimes we're asked to enter a competition, but more and more we're trying to seek out opportunities, because I'm still afraid that people are more likely to ask us to do a so-called public art project than a real architecture project. So I think we have to find occasions more. But that's kind of an introduction. Once we decide to do a project, can I say, maybe even before that, maybe I come across a project and I bring it up to other people in the studio, saying maybe we should try this. What do you think? Once we agree we want to do this, which happens usually pretty quickly. Then we have a meeting of the as I said, there were 4 designers plus me. We have a meeting together. We probably start with even if we're applying for something, there's a site. If we know the site, it's probably easier, and it's easier for us to start something. Like for example, sometime recently, we were invited to this invited competition, which meant maybe 10, 15 people would be asked. The competition was for a museum in Perm in Russia, and the site of the museum, when we looked at the material, the site of the museum was on this level ground that then we realized was next to a slope, and the slope went down, maybe even the equivalent of a few stories, went down to a body of water. So, I was probably thinking about, seeing it. I brought up to the studio, why don't we start thinking this way? The museum is supposed to be on this flat land, but there's a slope here. Can we think of the slope as a kind of call of the wild? The museum can't resist the slope. It's been told to be on top of this. It's been told to be on this flat land, but the slope is too strong. So the museum starts to fold down, goes down the slope. As it goes down the slope, it goes under a bridge. It goes over railroad tracks. And we started to think, Perm is a somewhat out of the way place in Russia. So we thought maybe the museum could double as a railroad station. So a train from elsewhere could bring people to the museum. Then the museum goes down to the water. Maybe part of it breaks off and starts to float in the water. So that's what I meant before about sometimes a site is a good way to begin. So anyway, it was kind of interesting that we were very interested in doing this building. I'm not sure if we thought about a museum enough, but we did in a way. We thought once this museum is folding, it would have this. It would almost be like a kind of origami method. So there wouldn't be any straight walls, which made us think, well, what do we do with the art in this museum? A long time ago, there was not so long ago, in the 50s or so, there was an Italian architect who lived in Sao Paulo in Brazil. Her name was Lina Bobardi, and I saw this photograph in passing, that she had designed an art installation of paintings, and she hung all these paintings in the middle of the room. So I thought, well, I thought that was kind of interesting, because you see the back of the painting as well as you see the front, so that the painting becomes almost sculpture It becomes part of a space that people can go through. And I thought for us, since we didn't have walls, maybe we should bring up this hanging method. We didn't get the we didn't win the competition, but like a lot of competitions, nobody won. You know, they give maybe 5 or 10 honorable mentions, including us. But sometimes competitions are an excuse not to build anything. I can't exactly say why. I mean, I don't know why. I don't mean I can't say.
In this process, for example, it seems like imagine
and we're all talking.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I start to talk off.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, I've taught a lot. You know, I think I'm best at having overall general ideas. I don't think I'm so good at specifics. Though I want there to be specifics, because I think only with specifics and concrete details can, if this thing were built, can people start to think for themselves. But I know I'm best. I probably still have a writer's mentality. I still write, like as you said, the Antarctica text, etc. You know, I mean, I write architecture. You know, I sometimes ask myself, because we're always having money problems. There's always the possibility that, you know, the studio can't go on. So I'm forced to ask myself, what do I do if I can't work with people? I go, well, maybe I can write architecture. Do I think that's as good? No, because, you know, it's a page in front of you. It's something you see on the internet. I think architecture has to be specific, even though, and has to be built, even though, you know, we built a very small percentage of our stuff. I'm not even sure now if we built 10%, 15%, but, you know, but we want to build what we think is worth building, you know. I mean, when I think of some projects in the past, you know, I don't know if it was necessary that we should have built that, but maybe we were desperate for building. Of course, you don't know. You don't know how you're going to feel later.
How willing are you to subject yourself to certain limitations?
Certain limitations?
To the limitations of, say you had a building planned, and then they said, no, well, we want to do this thing in this way, or that thing in that way. We would probably,
it depends what they say, but I want to do what we think is worth doing. Now, maybe if they suggest something, maybe it's just as worth doing as what we proposed, but I don't know that yet. You know, we have been in the middle of things, and then we not so much because we were told. Well, yeah, or we were told how to do something. We were working on a project in the south of France, in a small town actually, called Beaumont, which was very unlikely for us because people usually think of us, understandably, in terms of cities. Here people asked us to do new housing for this village in which the population was 400 people. So it was kind of unheard of for us, but we were attracted to it because, you know, we had never thought of doing something like this. And it was a village on the slope of a mountain. Farming was the way most people survived in this village, but they were on a mountain slope. So the way the village survived was to terrace the slope so that farming could occur. But that gave us our first idea. We thought maybe the housing should be built, should be terraced. So you could have a house that was partially outside the slope and partially inside. So as a byproduct, we could have something that was cooler in the summer, warmer in the winter. So we got very excited in this project, by this project. But then when they started to approve what we had proposed, they said that, well, you can continue this project up to what in architecture is called design development. You know, we could, because what we had proposed, what you propose in an initial stage, is a kind of general idea. You try to give some idea how it's going to look, but you don't know how it's going to look until you go further. So they seemed to get interested in that, but they said, then there's the last stage before building is what's called design development. So by that time you make construction or you make something almost like construction drawings.
Okay.
So but what they said was that we could continue on the project only until design development. Then they would bring a French architect in to finish it, and we didn't have we wouldn't have anything to do with it.
Okay.
I thought immediately that we've built so few buildings. I don't think we want to have our name on something that we didn't do, or that we only. It was like when Sergio Leone, the Italian director of westerns and very good westerns, particularly in the 70s, he was a director. Then he was a producer of movies, and then there were some movies that were produced by somebody, directed by somebody, from an idea by Sergio Leone. I don't know if we wanted to do that.
Your project with Stephen Hall
Yeah.
had a lot of people back at SHOWstudio in London interested. Can you talk a bit about that, the storefront for art and architecture?
Yeah.
Creating a space that integrated the street to some extent with the building.
Tried to. Stephen and I we didn't necessarily know each other well, but we had known each other a while. Stephen, I think came over to the studio when he first came to New York, which was in the mid 70s, and also saw a long video of mine and a number of videotapes of mine, but saw a long kind of almost history of America videotape called the red tapes, and but at that time I wasn't even thinking of architecture, but was doing installations. He said we should do a project together sometime, and I said, oh, yeah, I hadn't really thought of that. I don't think I've thought of architecture, but we had periodic encounters. At one point, he asked me to go to an architecture review of his at Columbia, but again, we were acquaintances more than friends. At the end of the '80s, and I don't remember how this started, but there was an organization in Washington that asked Stephen and I to work together on a block of buildings in Washington D.C. By that time, and this was maybe 1989, so I think it was right after the Acconci studio was formed. So by that time, yeah, I was thinking in terms of architecture. So we worked on this project, proposing, and it wasn't so much buildings. It was like renovate. It's hard to renovate things sometimes in Washington D.C. because, well, it depends. If you're in the white part of Washington, it's hard. If you're in the black part, you can do anything you want. Washington D.C. is maybe the most prejudiced place in the United States. But we were asked to do kinds of things like, can we deal with street furniture, etc. Can we? But I ended up not understanding why they asked us, because they always had objections like, well, you're interfering with l'enfant's plan. You can't do that. And I said, well, why did you ask us to come into this stuff? But anyway, it never led to anything. An organization that had formed, I'm not exactly sure when, I think in 85, 86, called Storefront for Art and Architecture, was formed by an architect named Kyung Park, and the person he was married to at the time, and now I can't remember her name, but she's become a very well-known artist. they asked us. They had heard about this project that never went anywhere in Washington, and they asked us, could we do we want to do a piece together in storefront for art and architecture? When Stephen and I talked together, and we were interested in doing something together, but we thought, do we really want to do a piece? And Stephen said he was interested in doing a piece because probably because he came from an architecture background, so it was interesting for him to do a piece. I came more from an art background. I didn't want to do pieces anymore, but we kind of resolved that. Wow, why don't we do something that renovates storefront? That it had been around by that time, since 85, 86, so 7 or 8 years. It had been done with. It was barely renovated when it was first done. It was kind of falling apart. So we thought, what about trying to renovate it? We had a very small budget, about $50,000. So we thought, how do we do this? We started throwing around ideas to each other, and it was kind of hard actually, even though, I thought Stephen and I seemed to know how to talk to each other. Once we started exchanging ideas, a strange thing happened. Maybe we wanted to collaborate so badly that we would propose something and disagreed on it, but next time Stephen would propose something closer to what I had proposed the last time, and I was proposing something closer to what Stephen had proposed. So we were constantly kind of at odds until after working for a while, and maybe a few months had gone by. I don't remember who brought this up. I think one thing I brought up is that we have very little money here, and Stephen very much brought that up. In fact, when we had asked the storefront people to meet, we were meeting at Stephen's office, and Stephen had a large sign up saying $50,000 equals no architecture. And I said, I don't know if that's the best way to start this collaboration. But I mean, Stephen was very concerned with how can we do something for such a small budget. I was probably more used to smaller budgets than Stephen, though at that time Stephen hadn't really built much. But we started to think that storefront is a very narrow space. It's about 100 feet long, but at its widest space, it's 15 feet wide. It's 5 meters wide. At its smallest, at its narrowest space, barely a meter wide. So we started to think, and I'm not sure now who started it. I think it was me, but I'm not sure. I started to think, maybe we shouldn't think of the space at all. Let's think of the facade of storefront, because maybe with $50,000 we could deal with the facade. The space is narrow enough that let's think of a facade that can move. Let's think of a facade on hinges, so that the space can be very easily changed. If the facade is here, each part of the facade, when it's hinged, goes partially in, partially out on the street, which made us think, all the while we had been talking about the street, this is maybe a way to join the inside and the outside. So both of us, I think, got interested in that idea. We had done a piece a few years. We, meaning SHOWstudio, had done a piece, say, two years before, a piece called Mobile Linear City, which was this truck that could travel anywhere. In the main part of the truck, there were these kinds of capsules that could pull out and make a kind of linear, almost a little linear city, and the way it worked was the facade. Each facade was hinged so that it could change. So I obviously, took the idea from that. Stephen was working with some changing facades that would bring light in differently. I think that was maybe the difference between Stephen and me, or Stephen Hall. Let's say more appropriately, Stephen Hall Associates and Acconci Studio, is that I like the idea of changing the space so people could act differently. Stephen, as a lot of architects, was very interested in light, and how light came in. But we disagreed a lot as we were working. But I think somehow we did a project that wasn't bad. I always disliked the fact that it's a pretty good space. I hoped, or we hoped, it's a pretty good space in spring and summer. It's not such a good space for fall and winter, because from fall and winter, it's opened and wind comes in, snow comes in, cold comes in. It's interesting that Stephen didn't bother Stephen as much as it bothered me. Stephen was used to doing architecture. I wasn't. So I wanted architecture more than Stephen probably wanted. I mean, I knew that at one point Stephen had said, as he was growing up, he wasn't sure whether he wanted to be an artist or an architect. And it's very significant that all of Stephen's projects begin with a Stephen Hall watercolor of his idea for a space, which is probably appropriate since he at one time thought he wanted to be an artist. So it's probably appropriate that I begin a space with words because I was a writer.
How would you say that words and buildings interact?
I can probably only talk about the way I use them, but I think words are the start of doing some kind of theory of architecture. Mm-hmm. But aside from that, I think they're totally opposite things. Mm-hmm. Of course, they can be words physically in a space, but words in a space in some ways are the opposite of architecture because words are in front of you. Whereas in architecture, if there's a word on a facade, it's maybe your introduction to the building, it's the presentation, it's the announcement of the building. But I don't know if that's architecture yet. I think only when you start to go through architecture are you in the middle of the architecture. Architecture is being in the middle of things. Actually, maybe I have to revise what I said. Visual words, printed words, are always in front of you. Oral words are different. Oral words make a space where I think you can be in the middle of an oral space. It's hard to tell sometimes where sound is coming from. Sometimes I think, or often I think that architecture and sound, or maybe you can say architecture and music, are possibly the same thing, in the sense that you don't look at anything. It's kind of an ambience. It's kind of an ambience around you. I'm not sure how to go.
Do you ever integrate?
But I don't know if they're words anymore. Then they're sounds. They can still have words. Mm-hmm. They can still have linguistic meaning. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I came upon a great statement, but by I don't know who, saying you can close your eyes, but you can't close your ears. Mm-hmm. So that oral space is a surrounding, and I think architecture is too. It's something I didn't do all my life or all my adult life, but what I do now is design and architecture, but I don't do it alone. I do it as part of a group of people, 4 designers, and I work together on projects. Our projects, we hope, can range. I think the first architecture is clothing. The way the skin covers the bones, clothing covers the skin and bones. And I think architecture begins with the body, and then maybe goes out from the body. The next step is things that you use with your hands, tools, utensils. The next step is furniture, seats or shelving. The next step may be the interior of buildings. The next step, the exterior of buildings. Then out to the streets of a city. You can do landscape. You can do public. You can do public spaces. And maybe the last step is, or one of the last steps, the outlands of the city. The rivers of a city, the leftover spaces of a city. And then I think the real architecture, or the next real architecture, is vehicles. Architecture that you can use to move, the opposite of space. Still the body. The way the body was in clothes, the body can be inside a car.